Welcome back, everyone, to the deep dive. Today we're going to be looking at something a little bit different.
Oh.
Yeah, it's a first-person account. It basically describes a world that has suddenly gone silent.
Interesting.
Yeah, so just imagine waking up one morning and all the sounds that you're used to hearing, like birds, chirping leaves, rustling,
Right.
even insects buzzing around, all of that, just gone.
What?
It's the reality that our protagonist is facing in this story.
That does sound a bit unsettling.
It is. It's pretty eerie, but it really makes you think about how important sound is in our world.
I agree.
So in the story, the narrator wakes up and right away notices that something's off.
Okay.
It's just too quiet.
Uh-huh.
At first, they think maybe it's just a really still morning,
Right.
But as they go outside, they start to realize that something is seriously wrong.
So they know that this is not normal.
Exactly. And it's not just quiet. It's like an absence of sound, like a void. Yeah, and that's what's so unsettling about it. It's like our brains are wired to pick up on those subtle audio cues.
I think you're right.
And when they're missing, it's like a red flag.
Like a warning sign.
Totally, like a warning sign that something is not right. And the story really emphasizes that, as the narrator starts to explore their surroundings, they find dead birds.
Oh, no.
Yeah, they see lifeless fish floating in the river.
Wow.
It just paints this really vivid picture of a pretty widespread ecological disaster.
Scary.
And it's happening so fast. It's truly alarming. Like someone just flipped a switch and muted the whole ecosystem.
So there's no gradual decline.
Nope, it's instant.
Instant silence.
Yeah, and that's where it gets really interesting.
It's yeah.
Well, because it makes you ask what could cause such a sudden and dramatic collapse.
Right.
What could do that?
Yeah, what could possibly?
And the story actually offers a potential clue.
Okay, what's that?
A few weeks before the silence fell, there was this widespread pesticide spraying in the area.
So the narrator starts to connect the dots.
Right. The sudden silence, the dead wildlife, and the pesticide use.
Okay.
It's like they're putting together this horrifying puzzle.
Yeah.
But is it really that simple?
That's the question, isn't it?
Could pesticides really be the sole culprit in wiping out an entire soundscape?
I mean, it's possible, right?
Well, we're going to have to find out.
Let's dig into it.
Yeah, let's look into this a little bit more.
Okay.
It's definitely a plausible explanation. Pesticides, especially certain types, can have a devastating effect on what we call non-target species.
Right, meaning creatures that weren't meant to be killed by the pesticide.
Exactly. But they get impacted anyway.
Yeah, like collateral damage almost.
Exactly. So can you break that down for us a bit? Like what types of pesticides would have this kind of widespread effect?
Sure. So one example is a class of pesticides called neonicotinoids.
Okay, I've heard of those.
Yeah. They're designed to target insect nervous systems.
Right.
But studies have shown that they can have a much broader impact. Yeah, they can affect birds, bees, even aquatic life.
Wow.
It's not just about killing the pests.
Right, it's like a chain reaction.
Exactly. There's a whole chain reaction that can happen.
And it disrupts the whole ecosystem.
Exactly. A disruption to the entire ecosystem.
And that brings us back to our story.
Okay.
Our narrator is facing this silent world potentially because of human actions, and they're left grappling with the implications of that.
That's a heavy thought.
It is. It really is. Yeah, it really does make you wonder, what if this happened, on a larger scale? What if the Earth just went silent?
I mean, that's a big question, isn't it?
It is.
And I think it goes deeper than just, not hearing the sounds we're used to.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Sound plays a really important role in how so many different species interact with the world around them.
It's true. We really do take those little audio cues for granted.
We do.
And the story highlights that psychological impact, too. The narrator talks about feeling isolated, helpless, even terrified. Because of the silence, it's like this sudden quiet just takes away their sense of security,
Yeah, it's like a constant reminder that something's not right.
Totally. And we were talking earlier about ecosystem collapse.
Right.
Can you explain that a little bit more? What does that actually mean?
Sure. So basically, ecosystem collapse is what happens when a natural system, loses its key species.
Uh-huh.
And those vital interactions between them start to break down.
Oh, okay.
It leads to a rapid decline in biodiversity, and it disrupts all those important functions that keep the ecosystem healthy and in balance.
So it's like a domino effect.
It is kind of like that. Yeah, you could think of it like a delicate web. If you start pulling out too many threads, the whole thing can unravel.
So in this story, those pesticides might have been the initial disruption.
Yeah, pulling out those threads.
And then leading to all these consequences.
Exactly. A cascade of consequences.
Resulting in a silent world.
Yeah, that's a really good way to put it. And it brings up some really important questions about, our use of pesticides in the real world.
Right, and the potential consequences.
Exactly, the unintended consequences.
But, okay, so we're focusing on pesticides, but could there be other things at play here?
Oh, absolutely.
Like, couldn't habitat loss or climate change also cause this kind of ecological disruption?
Of course they can.
Yeah.
In fact, it's important to remember that this story, it's a simplified scenario.
Right.
In reality, ecosystems are incredibly complex.
Yeah.
And their decline is usually driven by multiple factors, all interacting with each other.
Oh, I see.
So habitat loss, pollution, invasive species, climate change.
Okay.
All of these can weaken ecosystems and make them more vulnerable to these sudden disruptions like the one in the story.
So it's like the ecosystem was already on edge, and then the pesticides were just the final straw.
Exactly.
Wow, it's kind of like a perfect storm.
It is, yeah.
And I think it's really interesting how the story takes this scientific concept like ecosystem collapse and makes it so personal.
Right. It's told through the experience of one individual.
Exactly. And that makes it so much more relatable.
That's the power of storytelling.
Yeah, it really is.
It can make even these complex scientific ideas feel more real.
Yeah, it does.
More tangible.
Yeah.
And definitely more emotionally resonant.
And speaking of emotionally resonant, the way the narrator describes the silence as this void, it's just so haunting.
It really is.
Like the absence of sound becomes this entity.
Yeah, powerful.
Yeah, it's this chilling reminder of what's been lost.
I think it speaks to our human fear of the unknown.
Yeah, for sure.
We're creatures of habit,
Yeah.
We rely on a certain level of predictability in our environment.
Makes sense.
So when something as fundamental as the soundscape of our world changes so abruptly,
right,
it triggers this primal fear,
right,
a sense of unease, like what else might be lurking in that silence?
It really does make you appreciate those everyday sounds that we usually just tune out.
Yeah, for sure.
Like the birds singing, the wind in the trees. Yeah. They become like this reassurance that the world is working the way it's supposed to.
They are. Yeah, it's a constant reminder that we're part of this living, breathing world.
Right.
A complex web of interconnected systems. And this story, even though it's fictional, it's a powerful reminder of how fragile that web can be.
It's funny. Before we did this deep dive, I really don't think I would have thought twice about the birds chirping outside my window or like the wind rustling the leaves.
Right.
But now I find myself actively listening to those sounds, and I appreciate them in a whole new way.
I think that's a really great takeaway from this story.
Yeah.
It makes us think about, how we can move from just taking things for granted to actually appreciating them and being stewards of the natural world.
Yeah, for sure. And you mentioned earlier how sound is so important for all these different species.
Right.
Can you give us some real world examples of how humans are already impacting soundscapes?
Yeah, so one example is noise pollution.
Okay.
From traffic construction. Even just our constant use of electronic devices.
Mm-hmm. Wow, I hadn't even thought about that.
Yeah, it can interfere with bird communication.
Really?
Yeah, like making it harder for them to find mates or defend their territories. And it can also disrupt things like the echolocation that bats use.
Oh, wow.
To navigate and hunt.
So it's not just about a hypothetical silent world.
Right.
We're already creating these little pockets of silence, or at least disruption in the natural world.
Exactly. And, those disruptions can have kind of cascading effects.
Oh, yeah, I bet.
Throughout the whole ecosystem, impacting everything from pollination to seed dispersal,
yeah,
even predator-prey relationships.
So it's all connected.
It is. It all comes back to that idea of interconnectedness.
It's a lot to think about, that's for sure. So as we kind of wrap up our deep dive into this silent world,
okay,
what do you think is the most important message for our listeners?
I think for me, it's about awareness.
Okay.
This story, even though it's made up, it really forces us to pay attention to the sounds around us, to appreciate all those little sounds of life that are happening all the time, and to recognize that, in this context, silence isn't peace. It's a warning.
Silence is a warning. I like that. That's powerful. And it ties back to what we were talking about before about, how everything is connected. Right. What seems like a small change in one area can have a huge impact.
Exactly. It's a reminder that we're not separate from nature. We're a part of it. And our actions, even the ones that we think are, helping or controlling nature, can have consequences.
Yeah, sometimes unintended consequences. So one last question for you and for our listeners.
Okay.
If the Earth were to just go silent, like completely silent, what do you think the most profound impact on humanity would be?
That's a great question. I think the biggest impact wouldn't be the lack of sound itself, but the loss of what that silence represents.
And what's that?
The loss of that interconnected web of life that we depend on it would be like this really stark reminder of just how fragile we are, how much we need a healthy ecosystem, and what could happen if we don't take care of it.
Wow, that's a really powerful image to end on a silenced world. A reminder of everything we could lose. Well, to all our listeners out there, take a moment today to really listen to the sounds of nature, the symphony of life all around us, and let's all do our part to make sure that music never stops.